Now we're going to take a step away from the actual war and see what's going on the home front.
The story of the respective home fronts during the Civil War is a very interesting and complicated one. The first thing people need to understand is that there are very different experiences depending on whether you live in the United States or the Confederacy. There are some commonalities. People on both sides became used to much more intrusive central governments. Both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis set aside the writ of habeas corpus at one time or another. On the United States side, of course, there was disruption. Congress passed income tax legislation and conscripted Union men into the Army, although if you live in the United States, you only had about a 1 in 2 chance of doing military service because the war didn't call on a higher percentage than that. The United States economy put in a very impressive performance. It proved fully up to the task of producing the vast amount of material that the United States military forces needed, while also producing all the civilian goods that society would normally want. It had a tremendous economic engine that hummed along during the war, and although inflation went up to about 80%, it did so without any kind of government intervention in the economy, and that's a rate about equal to what happened in World War II and World War I, with much more governmental intervention. On the Confederate side, there's wide-scale economic dislocation, tremendous damage done to the transportation and communication infrastructure. It took a great deal more intervention on the part of the Confederate government because the industrial base was so much smaller. The Confederacy actually set up state-sponsored industries to produce armaments and powder and other things during the war. There was nothing equivalent in the United States. There are also an array of both monetary taxes and eventually a tax in kind where the government would take a portion of crops and other things. The difference for women's experiences in the two nations was extreme. The vast majority of women in the United States carried on generally as they would in life, although many farm women assumed a much harder burden of work when their soldier husbands were off with the Army, but they didn't experience the economic hardships that hit women, especially poorer women, in the Confederacy. There were extreme shortages of food and even of very basic things such as clothing on the Confederate home front. And every level of government in the Confederacy stepped in to provide what we would call welfare type assistance for poorer people, especially soldiers' wives in the Confederacy. There were times when women rioted in the Confederacy, especially in Richmond in 1863, because of shortages of food and other hardships that had been visited upon them by the war. But the real difference on the civilian side in the Confederacy was the profound dislocation to the normal activities of social life that the presence of United States armies brought. There are thousands of white refugees in the Confederacy, hundreds of thousands of black refugees in the Confederacy. In fact, the unraveling of the slave-based society in the Confederacy is one of the major themes of the home front on the Confederate side. As Union military forces penetrated deeper into the nation, it disrupted white control over African Americans, even as it disrupted the economy and transportation and almost every other element. In other words, did exactly the thing that the secessionists had hoped to avoid in leaving the Union in the first place. They brought on a war that brought armies to the Confederacy, that brought tremendous dislocation to almost every element of their economic, social, and political structures.
During the American Civil War, most women were on the home front, sometimes near military action, but more often distant from the battlefields. However, women influenced the war effort, encouraging men to enlist, finding ways to volunteer to support their cause, and adding their voices to support or protest the war. The power of the home front to keep armies in the field was quickly recognized. For some women, this opportunity brought new social roles and praise. For other women, particularly in the South, the power of the home front put them directly in the path of war. At certain times, the Civil War Homefront was invaded, bringing war and battle directly to the doorsteps of women. Some women in both North and South volunteered as nurses, usually in established hospitals or when war came to their community. For some, this was a revolutionary step and a role outside the home. For example, Phoebe Pember volunteered as a hospital matron at one of the largest hospitals in Richmond, Virginia. Susie King Taylor, a former enslaved woman who had found freedom, volunteered as a nurse with the United States Colored Troops. Clara Barton took medical supplies directly to field hospitals near active battlefields, and these supplies helped to save many soldiers' lives. Mary Ann Bickerdike, sometimes called Mother Bickerdike, was influential in the medical scene in the Western Theater with General Sherman's army. Kate Cumming left her Alabama home and volunteered in Confederate hospitals, eventually winning respect from doubtful surgeons. Some Northern women volunteered to teach freedmen, to learn to read, write, so that they would be able to find better jobs and make their way in their newfound freedom. Many women wrote letters to their soldiers in the military, and some women kept important diaries, all of which are helpful insights as we study the roles of women during the American Civil War. Mary Chestnut kept one of the most famous diaries of Southern women. She did edit her diary after the war, but what she wrote still provides valuable insight about upper Southern society. In New York City, Maria Ledig Daly kept a journal detailing her activities in Northern society and her views on the war from a distance. In Winchester, Virginia, multiple women kept diaries, giving many perspectives on war's invasion of their home front. They are sometimes called the Devil Diarists because the majority of women supported the Confederacy and complained about Union soldiers. An influential woman who Abraham Lincoln once said started this great war was Harriet Beecher Stowe. In the 1850s, she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that was important to the abolitionist movement. Harriet Tubman, an enslaved woman who escaped, became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. During the Civil War, she volunteered as a nurse and also did some scouting for the Union Army. The American Civil War gave some women the opportunity to push society's boundaries in unconventional ways. Dr. Mary Walker volunteered as a surgeon with the Union Army and became the first and so far only woman to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. Some women, both North and South, disguised themselves as soldiers and fought in the military ranks. Other women spied and passed information to military officers. Some of the famous spies of the war include Rose O'Neal Greenhow, Belle Boyd, and Elizabeth Van Lew. The American Civil War affected thousands of women. We don't know all of their stories or sometimes even their names, but Civil War veterans recognized the loss, sacrifice, struggles, and the triumphs of women who supported the war. One writer reflected, "It is not unusual for women of all countries to weep and to work for those who encounter the perils of war. But the American women, after giving up to the ranks of the gathering and advancing army, their husbands and sons, their brothers and lovers, proceeded to organize relief for them, and they did it with a self-controlled and rational consideration of the wisest and best means of accomplishing their purpose, which showed them to be the products and representatives of a new social era and a new political development."
So, as we've talked about in class, women were called upon to serve in the war just as much as the men, but in a different capacity. And so within 2 weeks of the start, thousands of local aid societies had been formed across the country. And those aid societies helped supply things like uniform, medical supplies, blankets, etc. Women also became nurses for the first time in military history. No matter their service, they never received official military appointments. Women in the North, they ran the farms, they worked in families, I'm guessing family stores, and they raised families. Women in the South managed the plantations. They also helped farm because, again, the South isn't all just big plantations. There are many small farmers there as well. And they worked on feeding their families, and they suffered through high inflation and food shortages throughout the war. Some memorable women that we will hopefully have some time to talk about more in class. Dorothea Dix, she was appointed by the Secretary of War as a superintendent of nurses at a Union Army hospital. And the nurses worked long hours and tended to some of the most gruesome injuries. And Dorothea Dix led those women as they dealt with some of these things they've never had to deal with before. Kate Cummings, she was honored Confederate nurse in the Mississippi region, and she wrote a memoir about her time serving. Phoebe Pember was a Confederate nurse. She served as a nurse and an administrator at the largest military hospital at the time during the war, and she also wrote a memoir about what she experienced. Clara Barton, who I think most of us probably know, was called the Angel of the Battlefield. She founded the American Red Cross during this time. Louisa May Alcott, she went on to write Little Women based on the experiences her family went through during the war. And then they mentioned Mary Edward Walker. She's the one and only woman to ever receive the Medal of Honor medal. But on the home front, these people faced a lot of challenges. And in the South, that is mostly women. The men, a large quantity of them are out in the battles. So 1862 battles, lots of high casualties on both sides. We have Antietam, the bloodiest day up till then. The Confederacy struggles to keep experienced troops in the field because they're dying quicker than they can actually train them. So one of the biggest problems was when they did their initial recruitment, they thought this war was going to be over really quickly. And so after the initial enlistment was over that one year, most of those soldiers went home to work on their farms and take care of their families. So the Confederate Congress enacts conscription, which most of us would call the draft. It's forced military service. So all men that were 18 to 35 are required to serve 3 years now instead of 1. Exempted, there was an exemption for one white man on a plantation with 20 plus slaves. They called this the 20 Negro law. So if you owned 20 slaves and were working on a plantation, you could be exempted because you need to stay to maintain the plantation. And there was fear about women being able to handle that and those kinds of things. This led to a lot of class division in the South. So not only are they fighting against the North, but they're kind of fighting amongst each other. The poor white Southerners saw that, or believed that they were essentially being used at the benefit and the interest of these wealthy planters to go out and put their lives on the line. In the spring of 1863 in Richmond, which is the capital of the Confederacy, we have the Richmond Bread Riots. And as we talked about in class, during war, most supplies, most commodities go to the war effort. And so poor women begin rioting in Richmond when there is a lack of supplies. And they believe that the merchants are withholding these supplies to drive up prices. And so they break into these stores, took what they needed, and eventually they had to send in authorities and threaten violence to get the unrest to stop. And similar events like this occurred throughout other southern cities, but the fact that it was happening in the capital just shows how absolutely dire the situation was. They also had the Impressment Act, which was passed by the Confederate government. It allowed the government to confiscate or seize and hold crops and other supplies from citizens. Farmers were supposed to receive fair prices, but that didn't necessarily happen. And again, farmers are feeling like they're being used and tensions are growing. There's not enough food, clothing, and supplies reaching the soldiers as well. So most of the time when they were marching, they're stealing crops. And actually that was one of the reasons that General Lee takes the guys into Philadelphia, takes the Confederate soldiers into Pennsylvania, is that they're out and they're looking for food, essentially. On the northern home front, before the Emancipation Proclamation, many Northerners opposed the war and how Lincoln was handling it. Business owners were eager to reestablish trade with the South. Families with Southern relatives really wanted to reconnect with them. They hadn't been talking. And there was also fear for a draft in the North, which, again, was to force men to fight for a cause, and a cause that most of them did not support. In the election of 1862, which was a midterm election, so it was mostly just Congress, the Copperheads won significant congressional victories. Remember that the Copperheads are essentially kind of Southern sympathizers, want to see the South come back into the Union. It gets even worse when the North does have to pass a conscription act in 1863. And so just like in the South with the 20 slave law, we had wealthy men in the North who could hire a substitute or pay a $300 fine and would not have to go off and fight. And so the poor and working class, especially in cities, opposed the Conscription Act because they were the ones that were sent to fight. Irish immigrants had fled a famine to face discrimination in the U.S., and they didn't want to fight to free the slaves that would essentially be competition for their jobs. Protests broke out in the North, too. So July 13th, 1863, New York, we see large draft riots. Protesters destroyed draft offices, violence escalated. There were 4 days of attacks on businesses, especially those that supported the war and African Americans. And African Americans were unfairly targeted and became scapegoats, or innocent people blamed for mistakes or faults of others. They were blamed for the war. They were blamed for taking jobs. So what they did is the mob destroyed a lot of African American homes. They lynched, which is another word for hanged, 11 African Americans. Many fled the city, about 20% of the population, and others moved to neighborhoods closer to police stations for protection. The police couldn't stop, so 4,000 Union troops were sent into New York City to assist. Many of them had just got done fighting in Gettysburg just a couple weeks earlier. More than 100 people were dead afterwards, and millions of dollars in property damage had occurred. After the protests, some men with families who had no other means of financial support were also given exemptions.